Hello and welcome to The Breach Show. My name is Aditya Rao and I'm a human rights lawyer and researcher currently based in Ottawa. I'm excited to be your guest host this week. I'm in the Montreal studio and I'm joined virtually by our panelists, Pam Palmater in Toronto and Elle Jones, who is in Winnipeg again this week. Martin Lukacs will be joining me later here in Montreal. Hey, you two.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, thanks for being here. Today, we've got an interview with socialist tech critic and author Paris Marx. Everyone's talking about electric cars these days, so we wanted to ask them for their take on the hype and the hidden cost of electric vehicles, how mining companies are using electric cars to greenwash their image. We also have a conversation about the NDP with Martin. With the Ontario NDP about to have a leadership race to replace Andrea Horwath, we'll take a look at the prospects for a new direction for the party. Well, panelists, I know normally this is the time we would ask you to talk about what's in your minds, but first, Elle, there's something you recently got off your mind. I mean, you wrote a book. As a treat for viewers of The Breach Show, we're going to offer a discount code people can use to pre-order the book at the end of the episode. Now, I know many of you are curious about this book, but you'll have to stick around for the end to hear what Elle has to say about it. With that said, what else is on folks' minds? Pam, I'm going to go to you first.
Well, I think the big topic in Indigenous country this week was really the Assembly of First Nations colossal mess that they created. And when I say the AFN, I'm talking about the regional chiefs and some of the executive staff who created what looked for, all appearances to be a massive political coup to try to take out the national chief, who is the very first woman that's ever been elected in the 54-year history of that organization. That was the National Indian Brotherhood and then the Assembly of First Nations. And just they profoundly and clearly didn't read the room. So they didn't even read their own charter. First of all, it was entirely illegal. They had no power. Only the chiefs have the power to elect in or remove a national chief. And then when they got to the assembly, they were just chastised by almost all of the chiefs there, the youth council, everybody who spoke. It was a real embarrassment. And ultimately, they lost that push. The chiefs said, you don't have the power. They kept National Chief Roseanne Archibald in place. And even more than that, they supported a call for a forensic audit of the organization. So at least out of this terrible embarrassment and political coup, we're going to get to find out what's really on the books.
Well, thank you very much for making note of that, Pam, and couldn't agree more that this is something that needs to be paid a lot of attention to. So, with that, Elle, let's turn to you and see what you have to say.
Well, I hesitate to turn this into the true crime podcast moment, but I guess I have a lot of crime and court news this week. So there's a really interesting case out of BC, which involves protesters that so-called broke and entered into a pig farm. In order to both draw attention to and to liberate the pigs that are suffering in this industrial farming. They were actually convicted, 2 out of the 3 protesters. But it's an interesting case because it raises a lot of issues about different communities in BC. So there's a particularly Sikh and Punjabi community that farms out there, and then also a Dutch-derived, quite evangelical community. And those 2 communities of farmers never meet. And we sort of saw these racial tensions throughout the trial. And one thing that the lawyer that was doing defense, Bibas Vase, pointed out when he was talking in the articles is that one of the jurors actually wore a Make Canada Great Again hoodie to the trial. So this, first of all, was allowed. It was an all-white jury. And this, of course, raised these issues of this particular evangelical right-wing idea about land and resources, the idea that you have the right to exploit resources. This same ideology has gone around the world, particularly, of course, during apartheid in South Africa, where the Dutch church was particularly involved in justifying and creating the ideology that was the foundation of apartheid. So that is a really interesting case to keep an eye on for the sentencing and to see what happens. But it also, of course, raises this issue of food supply, industrial farming, capitalism, and, of course, the land usage issues under that and how we think about nature and non-human beings.
Well, thank you so much, Elle, and thanks to you as well, Pam. As always, such great reflections on issues that matter to our communities. We're gonna go on now to our interview with Paris Marx and come back to you both for some more reflections on what Paris Marx had to say about the move towards electric vehicles and the greenwashing that mining companies are engaged in. The Liberal government announced on Monday that this is Electric Vehicle Week, with several announcements about electric vehicle infrastructure spending. As many as 245 million electric cars could be on the road by 2035. Between that and renewable energy projects, we're looking at a new global gold rush, except this time it's for the carbon, cobalt, and lithium needed to make batteries and other parts. To talk about the implications of the current push to electrification, we're joined by Paris Marx. Marx is the host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast and author of the new book, Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. They spoke to us last week in a wide-ranging interview on all things related to green transportation. We started off by looking at the hype surrounding electric vehicles.
When we think about Canada and our economy, we're very much a resource economy, right? Or that is a key part of our economy. Certainly it's diversified and there are other things that happen in the Canadian economy. But as a result of that, I think we're seeing a big push for electrification, in part because Canada is such a large mining power. There's not only mining that happens within Canada, but 75% of global mining companies are headquartered in Canada. And so I think that there's a lot of desire among these mining companies for this to be the future that we have, where we have this electrification, because that means there'll be a much higher demand for their product. The International Energy Agency estimates that if we go down this path of focusing on electric vehicles as the way that we solve this problem, then demand for lithium will increase by up to 40 to 100%. And minerals like cobalt and nickel will see increases of over 2,000%, respectively. And so those are huge increases. And by saying that we are mining these minerals so that they can help the green transition, it's able to greenwash the mining industry, which is this terribly extractive and destructive industry, not just within Canada, but particularly around the world, where a lot of Canadian mining companies operate without the kind of scrutiny that they might get when they operate here in Canada. And so that is one piece of this that I'm really concerned about as well, and that I think doesn't get the attention that it deserves when, we see stories or we see, politicians like Justin Trudeau or Doug Ford or, the Quebec Premier, championing these mining projects as key to the green transition, when actually there's a lot of problems with those mining projects and with the green transition or the idea of a green transition that they are putting forward.
The Toronto Stock Exchange proudly declares that it lists more mining companies than any exchange in the world. But Labour, environment, and Indigenous groups have tried for years to get Canadians to see it as our secret shame. This April, Canadian mining was in the spotlight again when 8 miners died after flash flooding at a zinc mine in Burkina Faso. Vancouver-based Trevally Mining appeared to have poor disaster management planning when it emerged that they did not have the equipment needed to pump water out of the shafts that the workers became trapped in. Trevally executives had to be stopped from fleeing the country. And showing just how much influence the industry has over government, Canada's ambassador to Burkina Faso tweeted her condolences to Canadian mining companies. We asked Marx how they see that colonial dynamic playing out as electrification intensifies.
The key here as well is to have a relationship with the Global South, because, there's still going to be mining happening in the Global South, whatever happens, where they actually have more power to determine the types of mining that happen in their communities, and have more power over ensuring that the mining that happens actually benefits them instead of just extracts from them, hurts their communities, and takes the profits and the benefits to the global north, which is basically what we see right now in many cases, right? And so, in one part is to think about the kind of transition that we want and the resource intensiveness of that transition. And that's a discussion that should be had not only within our communities here, not only within Canada, but again, like globally, with everyone who's going to be affected by that throughout the supply chain. But then also ensuring that the people who are going to be doing a lot of that extraction and a lot of that production also have more power to ensure that they're not just being harmed for a transition that benefits those of us in Canada, us Western consumers, and people in the Global South continue to pay the price that they have paid for many decades or centuries now, of colonization, imperialism, whatever you want to call it. Like, the key is not to say that there's not going to be any mining at all. Whichever pathway we take, there will be mining. But the question is, how is that mining done, and what is the quantity of mineral that will actually have to be extracted in the end in order to, fuel whatever kind of transition that we're going to pursue. And so the kind of electric vehicle oriented transition is one that is incredibly energy intensive. It's or resource intensive, and it's the one that is most resource intensive of the various pathways that are ahead of us. Whereas if we focus on getting people out of cars and into these other forms of transportation, whether it is into transit, whether it is on bikes, whether it is making communities that are more walkable so people can easily access things that they need within, the vicinity of where they live and might not even need one of those forms of transportation, then again, the resource intensiveness of those alternative options are much less than if everyone has their own personal electric automobile. And so, the key is then to put the funding where it's going to champion those things. And certainly the Liberals have been investing a bit. The federal liberals and provincial governments across the country have been investing in transit infrastructure, but I would say not nearly enough that we would need to see in order to encourage people and to get out of their cars to a much greater degree than we're seeing right now. And there's a lot more effort and focus being put into the electric automobile because it creates the jobs through resource extraction, but it also creates the jobs through manufacturing all of those automobiles that are so valuable in vote-rich regions like in southern Ontario, right?
And that focus is nothing new, which is why our discussion shifted to how deeply rooted Canadian car culture is, and how it's actually a recent development that's happened over the objections of communities.
So if you look at like the turn of the 20th century, in that moment, the automobile was very marginal. Like it didn't become popularized until like or really start to become, I guess, a bit more common. Popularized is the wrong term there, until the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and then it really takes off after the Second World War, right? And so at that moment, like the streets look very different than they do today. The streets are a shared space where there are people walking, there are people taking bicycles, there are people on the streetcars, there are people in horse-drawn carriages. Like there's a whole different range of modes of transportation that are on the same space, right? And that they're working together because they're all kind of low speed. They're not going very fast. You can kind of navigate around one another. But then when the automobile enters, it goes faster than these other modes of transportation, particularly as they start to improve. And it really disrupts the norms of the street. And then the question really becomes, because as you were saying, one of the problems there is that people start to die because this vehicle goes much faster than other modes of transportation that are on the street. People are not used to it. It breaks the norms of the street. And so people start to die, particularly children and young women. And, obviously people are going to be distressed when children and young women in particular are dying on the streets. And so, what ends up happening is this lobby of pro-auto groups, which obviously includes the auto companies, the oil companies, the suppliers to the auto companies, over time, construction interests and developers, because obviously they benefit from building out all the roads, the highways, the suburban communities that are required for automobility, and even labor groups support this naturally because, you have unionized manufacturing jobs, you have construction jobs, so obviously this is seen as beneficial, even though it's creating these communities that have a lot of consequences down the line once we can actually see the full effect of it. And so, just briefly, there are a number of ways that these lobby groups, because they couldn't affect this change on their own, ensured that the government worked with them to facilitate this transition to automobility, right? To communities that are centered around the automobile and a transportation system that is centered around the automobile. And some of the key parts of that within Canada, and obviously there are similar versions of this in the United States, is the build out of the highway system and the Trans-Canada highway system in particular after the Second World War. You have the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Association Agency. I can't remember the final word there. That basically, ensures it's possible for people to get mortgages so that they can buy these suburban homes. And so that is a transition that happens over the course of many decades as the automobile is normalized, as the alternatives to the automobile in many cases are removed in many cities.
Car makers, like mining companies, hope electrification can protect their power. The fact that there's little pushback so far doesn't just come down to car reliance. It's also about a culture of what's called tech optimism. Marx explains.
Like even during the pandemic, we saw the Canadian government give a contract to Amazon to supply PPE to various provinces. And then months later, on the down low, kind of said, oh, actually, later we realized Amazon couldn't deliver the service that we wanted. We just assumed they could, so we never actually used this after. On the contact tracing apps, the COVID alert was very much inspired by something that was pushed by Apple and Google, because they control the smartphones that pretty much everyone uses. And the code for the app was donated by Shopify, which is our kind of Canadian tech hero that we all love to love, apparently. And so the government has a very uncritical, I think, relationship to a lot of these big technology companies in a very worrying way. And I would say that part of the reason that we see this difference between what's happening now and maybe the government approaches in the past is really the effect of neoliberalism on the kind of thinking around what role the government can play in society and the kind of services that it should provide to people, right? Like the Uber example is so illustrative of so much with the tech industry over the past decade or so, right? Where you have all of these promises about how Uber is going to make traffic better and improve transportation in cities for underserved people and reduce car ownership, reduce emissions from transport. Like all of these things are going to get better because of Uber. And then a few years later, we see that actually they made traffic worse. They didn't do anything to car ownership. The people they benefited were mainly young, college educated people in urban areas earning above average incomes. Basically, your average tech worker is, the kind of person who's tending to benefit from these things, not everyone else. Meanwhile, they've destroyed the rights of taxi workers. They've destroyed the regulations on the industry. And the only way that they've been able to do this is by being massively subsidized with cheap money made possible in, the post 2008 low interest rates, QE kind of environment. And, they're able to remake an aspect, at least, of the transportation system to serve themselves. And now, after so many years, after they have succeeded in that deregulation and attacking workers, we're seeing that the prices are going up, that the service is not as convenient anymore because they've run through the possible workforce that they have, and people are fed up with the company because it pays so poorly, and people are even going back to taxis. And as a result, now Uber is trying to get taxis to come onto its app. And so you would hail a taxi from the Uber app after completely destroying the industry and remaking it to serve itself.
That was our interview with Paris Marx, author and host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast. You can read more from that interview at breachmedia.ca. All right, let's turn to our panel. Pam, I'm going to go to you first. In Ontario, Pam, Premier Doug Ford appears to be changing his tune on electric vehicles after systematically pulling out of provincial green energy commitments during his previous term as Premier. But many are skeptical, saying this is only an opportunity to fuel his mining push in Ontario's north. In fact, he seems to have rebranded his goal of digging up the so-called Ring of Fire in northern Ontario as part of a green transition, since the aim is to extract minerals for electric vehicle batteries. Pam, can you first tell our viewers what the Ring of Fire is, and then talk a little bit about how the plans to mine the area will affect the rights of the impacted First Nations?
Sure. The Ring of Fire is the name that's given to this massive planned chromite mining and smelting development project in basically the James Bay Lowlands area of northern Ontario, all First Nation territory. And they plan to use this. There's other minerals there too, but they plan to use this and other minerals for a wide variety of things. But electric cars seems to be the promotional material of choice these days. I think it's important to remember, however, that this is all First Nation territory, and that even the law in Canada has changed. So not only do our Indigenous laws paramount over those territories, but those rights have never been, respected. We also now have Canada, who's implemented the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So since Ford was first elected till now, though, everything has changed. And one of the things about this greenwashing, rebranding this mining now as being somewhat the answer to climate action really is just the same kind of greenwashing for the same very destructive uh, activities of the extractive industry. So you'll recall in the past how they used to say, oh, natural gas, that's the clean energy as compared to the tar sands, dirty oil, right? But they're all extractive industry. They're all destroying the environment and hurting human beings and resulting in, violence and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls. And so that's the very same thing here. I mean, even before Doug Ford tried to greenwash it with electric cars, he was saying that no matter what, he was going to develop that ring of fire because he was all about profits and money for Ontario, even if he had to jump on the bulldozer himself with complete disregard for First Nations rights or environmental issues. I mean, they have some of the largest wetlands up there, for example. So it's not as greenwashy as they would like it to be, as promoting for the Ring of Fire.
Pam, I do want to hear if you have any responses to what Paris Marx had to say about this issue as well.
The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People says not only do we own our traditional territories and all the resources on those territories, but we are the ones that have the right to be governing them, and nothing can happen on those territories without our free, prior and informed consent. So the legal standard is no longer consultation and a little bit of accommodation. It's literally consent. And the United Nations has affirmed this over and over and over again. And the United Nations Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has been sending Canada letters telling them to cease and desist, effectively stop or put a moratorium on all of these major extractive industry projects unless and until they have the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations who are on those territories. They're nowhere near that process right now. Historically, they've always used, the oppression and dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the impoverished socioeconomic conditions to kind of force them into these things. Well, the legal playing field has changed. So I don't think that anyone should be assuming that it can, should, or will go ahead. And keeping in mind that there's lots of other ways to approach how we address climate action. Yes, electric cars could be a part of that, but there's also other things, creating infrastructure and social supports so that there's less cars, there's less need for travel, less need for deliveries, more focused on not just local but literally in communities and neighborhoods. I mean, you've had futurists from 4 decades ago like Arthur C. Clarke's envisioning a world that was focused on telecommuting, in the sense of we would not need these massive cities and all of this transportation anymore, that we would be more focused on working from home, getting services at home, being able to walk to your grocery store or have your groceries, brought to you by others. Like, there's just a whole world of other possibilities other than going from one destructive extractive industry process to another and just assuming, well, this is the least worst option of all of the worst options.
Elle, I'm going to go to you for this next question. Elle, industry lobbyists and PR firms have pushed the idea that individual consumer choices are enough to fight the climate crisis. Take shorter showers and bike more, for example. But this focus on individual responsibility is convenient for corporations, especially since research shows that only 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of global emissions. Electric vehicles are now becoming the next thing that individuals must do. What will it take to redirect that energy towards building real public transit and livable communities?
Yeah, so a few things. And first of all, many people with disabilities have pointed out that so many of these so-called solutions are extremely ableist. Like, don't use straws, but that's fine unless you need a straw. Bike and walk more, but some people can't. So, this idea of individual responsibility becomes very classist. It often becomes very ableist. It's very anti-poor. Of course, people that live in, nice suburban neighborhoods with sweeping streets can do something. But if you live in a tiny building or on a reserve where there's no bus service to start with, and then you're going to have to drive. So it always assumes a kind of privilege and economic ability to make these choices. And many people have talked about this in all kinds of ways, how any choice dialogue, whether it be on abortion or whether it be on just choose to treat the environment better, always assumes that people actually have this range of choices that often people don't. So I think that's the first thing. In terms of talking about transportation and those sort of things, those are actually public safety. And so going back to what I said at the beginning, where, Winnipeg's in this conversation about public safety, but it just is through crime and policing. And in fact, of course, when we talk about things like defunding that we've talked about a lot on this show, that is the main point, that we need to shift the resources into actual things that are safe, such as safe ways to walk, such as making sure there's transport into all communities, not just rich communities that have so many options, of course, into rural communities, of course, into so many Indigenous communities and reserves where bus service and all these things have been cut. What actually keeps us safe? How about not dumping chemicals into our harbor? How is it that we live, if you live in Halifax, where we live on the waterfront and we don't even go to beaches? There's no such thing as a city beach. In fact, years ago, Mayor Peter Kelly, which I sometimes think about randomly when I'm running, I'll sometimes think about this, when he tried to go swimming off Black Rock Beach in Point Pleasant Park, and there was all this poo and tampons floating around, and he had to get out of the water because it was just covered in feces and old menstrual products and stuff. So, that shows us something, right? That and often people that come to Canada from other countries are shocked that we have all this ocean and we don't even use it because it's polluted. So this idea that this should be where food comes from, this should be where people can live and make a living. And instead, we'd rather pollute it all and then tell people, you can't have a plastic bag at the grocery store. That's how we're going to deal with it. Lawyers have also pointed out as well that we should be able to do lawsuits on these corporations. They used to say that they couldn't, we couldn't do that because us idling our cars was just as culpable as, the oil company that's responsible for, a huge amount of the world's pollution. And in fact, of course, we now know, as you said, that it's a small amount of companies that are responsible for the vast amount of pollution. So if we want to talk about prosecuting crime, we should be prosecuting corporate killers who kill far more people and injure people and make us sick through destroying our environment and our shared place that we live. How about we actually start charging people for polluting the harbor or killing wildlife or destroying Indigenous communities? If we actually did those penalties, then we would also have money from their unpaid taxes to do things like actually build a walkway or make sure there's safe transit routes. So what it shows us, as always, is that capitalism will make these small adjustments to keep us from rising up and to pretend that we're changing the status quo. And in fact, what we're doing is always just sticking with the status quo. And that's really seen even by that point about how roads used to be shared. They used to be places that children played. It was expected that the streets belonged to the people. And then the auto industry starts this long campaign to make us believe that streets are for cars and that pedestrians are the ones that the interlopers. So, we've seen this actually, this isn't just something that happened naturally. These things are unnatural and they have been forced upon us. And then we're taught to believe that there's no other way. We can't imagine our streets in any other way. And that's simply not true. So as always, we need to imagine the world that we know is possible and then do something about it and push our politicians, whether through protesting or voting or forcing the right people into office or people power or sitting in or whatever we need to do to make these real changes that are actually possible. Because it was possible to shift once, it's possible to shift away. And we have to believe that.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to the Ontario NDP. Could a new leader of the Ontario NDP shake up the party's fortunes in the province? Andrea Horwath, the first woman to lead the Ontario NDP, fought 4 elections over 13 years. She was widely criticized for running on the right of the Liberals in 2014, and she eventually led the party to official opposition in 2018. In June of this year, Horwath failed for a second time to defeat the right-wing Premier, Doug Ford. With Horwath's NDP failing to convince Ontarians of a clear alternative, despite Ford's disastrous record in government, she announced her resignation. With the party now on the verge of a race to elect her replacement, is there any sign of a reckoning about the party's direction, or will the party continue on its current track? I'm talking with Martin Lukacs today. Well, Martin, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with the Ontario NDP election, who the candidates are, and what's going on?
Sure. Well, no candidate has officially declared that they're running yet, but we have a sense that a few candidates are already preparing teams and planning for a run. We did find out today that Joel Harden, the Socialist MPP from Ottawa and the critic of disabilities, seniors and pensions, is not running. So that's a real big disappointment for people on the left who are hoping he would kind of be the torchbearer for socialist politics. We do know that Merritt Stiles, who is a former school board trustee and was the education critic in the last 4 years for the Ontario NDP from Toronto, is planning a run. She's been kind of cobbling together a team, making calls. She's progressive, but definitely not a socialist. And she's someone also who's quite close to the party establishment. She was president of the NDP, federal NDP, for a few years, 2016 and 2018. Then there's a few other names that are kind of being tossed around. There's Laura May Lindo, there's Solma Makwe, there's Catherine Fife, and Guratan Singh as well has said he's still considering it. In terms of timelines, we don't know for the election, largely in part because the party brass has kind of kept that closer to their chest. There has been some pushback about what was expected to be a quick election in the fall from the Ontario Federation of Labour and other labour unions affiliated to the NDP, who said that, a short election like in the fall would mean that there wouldn't be any time for candidates to sign up members and really build momentum and attract attention to the party. It's clear, though, that to the party brass, I think a quick election would have favored a more establishment-friendly candidate and pose an obstacle to, for instance, a more left-wing candidate who's lesser known, who would need a bit of time to build momentum, And I think, the party brass and candidates like Merritt Stiles, I think do share a lot of commonalities in the sense that I don't think they believe that what the party needs is an overhaul. I think likely what they would say is that it's more of a communication problem in terms of communicating their message and platform to the public. They need to do it more effectively. But I think a lot of people think that what's needed is more than just a communication shift. There needs to be a real overhaul to the party in terms of the vision being more bold, in terms of, too often the party's kind of run like a tin pot autocracy. And I think there needs to be a real shift in how the party relates to social movements and also grassroots members.
Let's talk about that a little bit and unpack that a bit, Martin. You have been very clear about what needs to change in the past and been a very vocal critic of the NDP and the direction it's taken. And there's an opportunity here for things to maybe change. And so I guess my question to you is, what is your advice to these leadership candidates now as people are mulling to put their name in the ring? And what's your advice to them? If they were here, what would you tell them that they need to do to be talking about for the NDP to actually win power?
Right. Well, I'm not sure people would come to me for advice, but if I could offer one thing, I would say that I would love to see a leader or a potential leader put on the table a solution to one of the core problems of the NDP, which is that the party, in terms of its decision making, in terms of its policy development, in terms of its campaigning, has just become too centralized. Basically, most of the key decisions when it comes to these things are made by a very small circle of advisors, consultants, staff. Basically today's NDP is like 3 marketing agencies in a trench coat. And I think that needs to change, and we need to see a plan from a leader to change that. So, I think too often the membership are treated kind of like an ATM. Like for anyone who's signed up to an NDP list before, they know that mostly you're just going to be bombarded with like fundraising emails after another, And so I think, a leader would need to show that they're interested in investing in organizing and in empowering the most important and also most neglected asset of the party, which is its base of activists, many of whom have drifted away from the party in recent years.
What does that empowerment look like?
Well, when's the last time, for instance, that the NDP membership had been called on to campaign and mobilize on an issue like on a year-round basis, in the way that we've seen Bernie Sanders do in the States, or Momentum, which is a Labour-affiliated party in the UK, do, basically empower members to run campaigns and canvass year-round and get energized and animated. Too often, the kind of consultant class that runs the party is really fixated on polling, pumping money into ad campaigns, and really paying too much attention to what the elite media thinks about what they're doing. And so often neglects, the appetite that activists or former activists or potential activists would have if they offered them something to do.
And are there members who are organizing around some of this work, who are trying to push the party in a different direction?
Yeah, there are members in Ontario who are pushing exactly for something like this. So there's, for instance, a group called Ontario New Demo Chat. They could probably work on the name, but they've been doing a lot of really incredible work. They, for instance, it's a group of like grassroots NDP activists, and they have put together a really terrific document, which is basically a crowdsourced list of demands, steps that the NDP could take if it wanted to campaign and act differently. So run issue-based campaigns, not just electoral campaigns. Offer more support for organizing at the riding level. Create, standing committees of where members could have input on policy. So that's not just a narrow, band of people setting these things. Create more transparent candidate searches. For instance, there's a real problem with the party center stifling exciting, radical, dynamic candidates who are often selected at the local level, but then kiboshed by the party center for one indiscretion or another or the things that they view as an indiscretion. So the party could do a lot more to basically set into place, grassroots infrastructure that would, unleash the energy of activists, and that's just simply not happening right now.
So it sounds like there's a lot of folks who are trying to organize around some of these issues, and the direction in which you're talking about the party could be thinking of going. What I'm wondering is, would you then say that, I guess the party would respond maybe saying, well, listen, we're a democratic party. If folks want to change the direction of the party, get involved, get a membership, join the party, show up to meetings, propose resolutions, move the party in the direction you want the party to go in. And it sounds like the folks in New Demo Chat are trying to do some of that work. Do you think that's the right way forward? Is that going to be effective?
It's a good question. I have a lot of respect for people who are like duking it out in the party. But honestly, reforming a party like the NDP from the inside is like a pretty masochistic enterprise. It is very difficult to do, in part because the party is so, as it's currently constituted, unresponsive to any grassroots bottom-up movement, So I do feel that activists working within the party are often just spinning their wheels. And they are, laying a great foundation for when it becomes possible for grassroots energy to make its mark in the party. But I really find it hard to imagine that happening unless we see, left-wing leadership emerge, either at the provincial level or at the federal level. And I think, as we've seen in other countries, it's only at that point that a party can be opened up to bottom-up energy. So I'm kind of loath to encourage people to get involved, because really they're just hitting their head up against a wall. I would say it's probably more worthwhile, even if you are invested in transforming the NDP at this moment in time, to invest your energy in building the power of independent social movements. So join membership-based progressive organizations, join a union, or maybe your workplace already has a union, so get involved in work action there, or get involved in social movement organizing, whether it's climate justice or Indigenous rights or BLM. I think that if we build the power of independent social movements, we will gain a lot more leverage vis-a-vis the party, and be able to influence it from the outside for the time being. And when the moment comes that there's a leader who's actually committed to democratizing the party, I think that changes opportunities for input from activists.
Well, Martin, I do want to know your thoughts, on the question of populism that I think is on top of everybody's mind as we see some faux populists on the right really gaining ground and organizing folks, thousands of people showing up at rallies for people who are really not going to be fighting for their interests. And so, for both the NDP and the broader left, what is the best response to these faux populists on the right, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're living in a political moment in Canada that is not unlike the one that transpired in the States when Donald Trump came to power, which is, you have these faux populist right-wing politicians who are absolutely preying on the fears and anger, often legitimate, of working class people. And I don't mean just like blue collar white workers, but like a racialized, diverse working class, which we're seeing being attracted to rallies like that of Pierre Poilievre. To me, it's an absolute travesty that the NDP has let Pierre Poilievre, who is a lifelong politician and a absolute campus conservative dweeb, basically pass himself off as an anti-establishment maverick, who is going to like rattle the palaces and mansions of the rich and wealthy in this country. He has only done his entire life the opposite: serve their interests, enable their enrichment, attack working class, racialized people, labor unions, the only people in this country who actually defend the interests of the majority. So I just think that there is absolutely fallow, fertile ground for a left-wing populist message to resonate. So many people in their bones understand how deeply unequal this country is, and we need to be channeling that anger towards constructive, ecological, socialist solutions that will redistribute wealth, and really lean into a kind of class warfare that, unfortunately, right now we're only seeing simulated by people like Pierre Poilievre, and in Ontario, certainly people like Doug Ford when he first came to power. So, it seems to me very evident where the winds are blowing, and there are lots of eco-socialist challengers and insurgent candidates who are putting these kinds of bold demands on the table that would materially improve people's lives in a way that they can understand. And I think if the NDP has any hope in hell of beating back the right and of improving their electoral prospects, they need to really pick up this mantle as challengers of the establishment and in the interests of the working majority.
Well, Martin, it's always such a pleasure to hear your thoughts on what needs to happen with the left, and thank you for your analysis as always. That's all I think we have for time for this segment, but thanks again, Martin, for joining us.
Thanks, Addy.
That's almost it for the show this week, folks, but Elle, you're not quite off the hook just yet. You've got to tell us about your new book. So, Elle, tell us about your book.
Yeah, so I have a new book that's really a collection of work going back. The last book I published was 2014, so it's been a while. So it's poetry, essays, both personal essays and more theoretical, perhaps. I hope it's not super academic, but it's really about sort of being on the front lines of fighting state violence. It deals a lot with prisons, deportations, the whole carceral system in various ways. So I talk about things like the fight for Abdul Abdi and Abdullahi Elmi. I talk about a lot of the work that I do with prisoners. And the title, Abolitionist Intimacies, is really about how our love is so important to this work. So it's really about my relationships with people. So it's not a theoretical text on what is abolition. It's really trying to think through how it feels to do this work and what our commitments are. Really a real love letter in a lot of ways to a lot of the people I've worked with in prison and the love that they've shown me. And then also reflection on how the state abuses our intimacy. So things like the strip search or controlling visits. So all the ways that intimacy under the state becomes corrupted and how they try to control it. And then how we also resist. So it's a lot of different stuff. Some of the essays are adaptations and stuff on the Halifax Examiner. And thank you to Tim Bousquet for, coughing those up and not, not charging for them. And then, yes, like as I said, some of my spoken word poetry and different stuff. So I'm hearing good things about it from people who have read it. You never know with your own book. And it comes out in November from Burnwood Press. You can purchase it if you're a Breach watcher or listener. There's a special code that we made for you. I think it's Breach15. Is that correct? That's for 15% off. You better put that up on the screen. So you can start pre-orders now, and hopefully you all like my book. And you should also buy Pam's while you're at it, because Pam has about 100 books. Pam publishes a book like every year, and it takes me like a decade. Like, it takes me so long. I actually talk about this in the book, about how I like never publish anything. But...
Oh my gosh, can I pay extra to get it signed?
Of course, you can all get it signed. You know, well, you don't pay. I'll just sign it. But, yeah. No, $1,000, and you have to jump on a bulldozer.
Oh yeah, well I can do the jumping.
Well, Elle, there's no doubt that that our viewers, readers, and sustainers of The Breach are going to be very excited to get their hands on this book. So, like you said, we do have a special code for a discount for friends of The Breach. It is Breach15. That's all capital letters and then the number. So, thanks to everyone who pre-orders, and thanks to our panel. Thank you so much for all of your great insights and your comments as usual. And thanks to all of you viewers for tuning in. As always, if you liked what you've seen here, don't forget to like and subscribe. Or if you're listening to the podcast, remember to rate and share. And if you want to help sustain the work of The Breach, consider becoming a sustainer by going to breachmedia.ca. I'm Aditya Rao, signing off for The Breach Show.